So I made 50 games in one day, and it was hell. Before we get started, I want to show off my game Darkest in the Crowd because it's available on the Steam store for only like $5, and who can't afford $5? So I'm about to hop over to Unity and show you what I just created. It took me a while, but eventually I found a game that I kind of really want to work on further. So I started off with a basic field where the character could move in any direction. The basis of the first game was to make a character avoid the enemy that chases them around the screen. Creative, right? The basis of the second game was similar to the first, but instead of random blocks spawned around the screen, in this game you had to collect the blocks to gain points. Game 3 followed the same, well, unique guidelines as Game 1, but this time it had multiple enemies you had to avoid. Even more creative. Game 4 was a Flappy Bird ripoff, but it came with its own set of struggles. I had to develop a new movement script for this sort of movement, and a script that'll spawn the tunnels. Although not extremely difficult, it was timely. Game 5 also followed the same set of creativity, where you just picked up points in the Flappy Bird type of movement. Game 6 rehashed games 1 and 2 and put them together where you collected points while being chased by this enemy. It's not too terribly creative as well, but it was something. Game 7 just pretty much switched the perspective of the camera for Flappy Bird. Game 8 allowed the player to move freely in a first-person view, collecting points in the open space. Game 9 followed the same basis, but instead of collecting points, you were avoiding walls. Game 10, we started to change things up a bit by making projectiles that we'd launch at fallen objects. This had its own complications as well, since we had to first make the script that fired the projectiles, make the enemies interact with the projectiles, and make the player interact with the enemies. Game 11 was Game 10, but in first person. Then there came Game 13 and 14, which were Games 10 and 11, but collecting points rather than avoiding them. There was also a variation where the enemies would despawn after hitting the floor, and that would make up Game 15. Game 16 consisted of a player and an area that you'd be able to move around to move your player and the other game elements in order to collect more points. The thing that made Game 16 a little bit more complicated was that I had to start spawning elements as a child rather than just within the entire map itself. Game 17 was a lot like those mobile app games that you'd see in the App Store, where there's a ball that you'd move around while your camera would continuously shoot out different objects, and if the objects overlap, then you lose. Game 17 also had its complications since I had to remember how to rotate object, and I kinda did it a really stupid way at first and it took me several tries to finally figure it out. Game 18 is exactly like Game 17, but instead of spinning around a sphere, you're spinning around a cube. In Game 19, you jump from platform to platform, each time you collide with a platform, it would spawn a new platform in front of you. Game 20 expanded on Game 19, where it caused objects to fall from the sky, and every time they'd hit you, you would die. Game 21 did something similar, where instead of trying to avoid the enemies, you're trying to catch the points falling from the sky. Game 22 made the points stationary, so you just have to fly into them wherever they spawned. Game 23 made the enemies stick to the player, so it'd be much more difficult to get around. Game 24 was by far my favorite as it gave off a Katamari feel. I kind of want to work on this idea a bit further in the future, but at the moment, this is Game 24. Game 25 was pretty much a Gar.io, but like in 3D, which, I mean, I don't know, cool concept, wouldn't do much with it. Game 26 was like Game 25, a Gar.io, except it had other objects that'll make you shrink as well, and if you shrink too low, you die. Game 27 had a basic platform for the player to balance on and would avoid enemies falling from the sky. Game 28 would be much like Game 27, except you could score points as well. Game 29 kinda goes backwards, where it uses Flappy Bird but also adds in scoring points on the alternative. Game 30 goes all the way back to the first idea, where it creates 2 players and 3 enemies and has them face off in a small arena. Game 31 took the original idea of the parkour and made it in first person. Game 32 also gave off a Katamari feel, as it was the same game, but with a spherical character instead. Game 33 was a lot of fun because it let me play around with a new type of movement where you just shoot a weapon and the burst of that weapon will just push you forward towards wherever you're looking at. We use this type of movement in a combat game where it's kind of arena style while you try to blast enemies while trying not to launch yourself to other ones. For Game 34 we reused the Flappy Bird area but with this style of movement for more interesting gameplay. For Game 36, I took that mobile idea from earlier and I made it so the thing constantly spun in random directions over a random amount of time, and you would just continuously have to hit space in order to place the blocks. For Game 37, I had those blocks that were trying to push each other off, and instead I had them try to push each other into the corners of the map, and if you did hit a corner, then you would die, otherwise the other objects would die. Game 38, I made a bit of a physics game where you just try to knock over all the blocks as soon as you possibly can by firing other balls at it. Game 39, I did the same thing again, but with more power to the balls and a different formation. It was a lot of fun, so I just, had fun with it. In Game 40, you tried to roll the ball into the little hoop in the middle, and when you did, well, nothing happened, but you learned from the best. In game 41, I made it so you clicked on different blocks in order to make the ball land onto the golden block in the very middle. In game 42, I had a bunch of blocks fall from the sky, and if they hit the ground, then you lose, so you have to click on them in order to make them disappear. For game 43, I took the idea of the cannon blasting you around, and I used that for a fallen object game as well, but instead of being able to click on them, you just have to avoid them and possibly shoot them. I forgot the code, to be honest. I tried shooting them at one point. I don't think it worked. You see, once you've made like 43 games, you start to lose track of what the code is, and you also start to not care as much. So I was just, throwing in random assets that I had made previously and trying to make the best game as I could out of them. And, well, this is where we're at. Game 44, we went back to the cannon asset, and rather than having it avoid things, you're trying to collect points through this type of movement style, and the points would only spawn to your right, so you just keep on making more and more progress. In game 45, every enemy would move as you would move, so you had to get to the certain area within the map without getting hit by the enemies. In game 46, you'd have 3 players that had to collect all of the points on the map. It was, I started getting really creative at that point. The same thing goes with game 47, where you have to shoot all the enemies with 3 players, and also avoid all the enemies at the same time. Game 48 goes all the way back to game 1, but instead of having 1 player, you have 2 players. That's the only difference. So for game 49, I made 3 players in the Katamari style of game, and if any of the players fell off the arena, then they would make you restart the game. For game 50, we went back to the sumo wrestling type of style of game, where we would instead have 2 players and 3 enemies, and you would just have to knock off one of the enemies or all of the enemies without getting hit into one of the corners. So that was all 50 of my games, all made within one day, and it was one hell of a process. But I learned a lot of really cool, interesting techniques that I completely forgot how to do when I was working on my one solo project for so long. I really enjoyed doing this. I learned a lot, and there's another game that I really want to work on that I've mentioned multiple times before, the Katamari type game. But I want to make it into a hyper-casual type of game where you have to like fight off against other enemies, and I don't know, I have a really cool, good plan for that, and I'm excited for it. Those were my 50 games in one day. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed.